This is Hannibal here from the HannibalTV.com, and we are live with more of a spirituality and science related interview today with very interesting author Mona Sobhani, who I will tell you a bit about her. She's written a book called Proof of Spiritual Phenomena. She is actually a neuroscientist. She holds PhDs, and I'm hearing an echo, but okay, there, it's gone now. But yeah, she has an interest in the connection between science and spirituality. So to start this off, you live in LA. Could you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in neuroscience to begin with? Because I know you were more interested in that before you got your other interest.
Yeah, for sure. I was always interested in human behavior. Like why do certain people act the way that they do, and why do some people get along really well and not well with others? And in particular, I was really interested in psychopathic traits. So, like, what causes a person to behave completely in an antisocial way, in a way that's not accepted by society, and that's very callous and unemotional. So, when I went to graduate school, that's what I studied. I studied psychopathic traits, and we used neuroimaging, which is basically the MRI machine, to record structural and functional pictures of the brain and look at the connection between those personality traits and the brain's structure and function. But I was always curious about, how do our environments influence how we grow up? How do our genes? And then ultimately, how does that shape our brains, which seems to drive a lot of our behaviors? So that's kind of why I got into it.
Well, in the wrestling industry that we cover, there's a lot of people that probably have the psychopathic traits. What did you find about that before we get into the other stuff that were kind of common with those type of brains?
Yeah. I think the most interesting thing was I was initially interested in this kind of debate between nature versus nurture, which is a very common thing we're interested in science. Like, is it the environment you grow up in, or is it something you're born with? It could be any number of personality traits, but obviously for psychopathy, that's what I was interested in. Is, do you grow up in a bad neighborhood? Were you maltreated? Did you encounter trauma, and that's what caused you to turn out a little callous and unemotional and all the other various traits they have? Or was it something you're born with? Because you find these stories of children at really young ages who start displaying these behaviors. You know, some people used to think too early, like at such young ages that they hadn't had a chance to be influenced by their environment. But we found, and we know now, as with many other things, because epigenetics is much bigger now, that it's both nature and nurture, right? Like, you're born with a predisposition to certain things, but your environment and your social interactions and what you eat and how you sleep and literally everything can turn genes off and on. So even if you're born with something, like, your environment influences that a lot. And I thought that that was really interesting and just such an important thing to focus on when we're thinking about personality traits and why people behave the ways that they do. There's a lot of factors to take into consideration. So I think that was the most important thing.
I was actually just recently watching a documentary on the Iceman, famous murderer that I'm sure you're aware of,
Yeah.
and he had a horrible childhood.
Mm.
So perhaps what you're saying is he may have naturally had that side because when it came out, it really came out. But had he been brought up a bit differently,
Yeah.
maybe it would never have come out.
Yes, exactly. And what we do need more research around is, what are these early life experiences? Like, what is the array of them? How do they impact us specifically? And there's some research being done on that, but it goes really to the moment you're born, like whether your caretaker can attune with you, like during feedings, or even attune to your needs. Like, all those kinds of things actually end up affecting you as you get older. So I think, but as I mentioned, some people are just, they have some genetic, I don't even like the word predisposition, but they have a set of genes that, they like, I don't want to give an example, but you know what I mean. So yeah, if they're if they're activated in the environment, they're not getting the care that they need, or they're in an environment where they're bullied, or they grow up in a social environment where everyone that they know engages in violent behavior or something like that, then it might be more likely that they display that side of their, express that side of their makeup. Whereas if they'd grown up in a more, loving, caring environment where they were taught to regulate their emotions or healthily express their emotions, then they may not have had to find, um, an expression such as, criminal behavior or manipulating and hurting other people, or whatever the case may be that it ends up being for them.
Do you think that transmagnetic therapy can help people like that? Because I know they're using that now in not only mental health centers, but for some people with concussion issues and stuff as well, to fix brain issues.
Yeah, it's possible. I don't know. I haven't heard of that, but it's possible that someone's looking into it. I think in theory, yes, but yeah, there would need to be a lot more research done, I think.
So you are supposedly the most unlikely person to see the spirituality connection with science, which apparently there's a lot more people that are open-minded to that now than we think. But
Mhm.
what was the moment where you started to become a little bit more open-minded to that side of things?
It took me a while, but because I didn't grow up in a very spiritual or religious household. I was never interested, or I actually became quite anti religion and spirituality when I went through my training as a scientist, because just because of the way that they train us to be extremely skeptical of everything. They also train us to believe that the universe is random and meaningless, and that any meaning that you find in events are your brain creating meaning, right? It's like there is no external inherent meaning in the world. It's all us. We look at something and there's an acorn on the floor and it's meaningful to me for some reason. So that's what we learn. And I think that I was a little more open in college, a little more like, oh, I don't know, the universe is mysterious, life is so interesting. But honestly, when you go through really rigorous scientific training, some of that is beaten out of you. So you kind of become disenchanted with the world. Um, and so I really wasn't into that stuff, but I am Persian, and in my culture, we do have a tradition of divination, which is basically you can use anything. You can use tarot cards or whatever, but our family my grandmother in particular used this Armenian type of coffee, which is like a thick coffee where you keep the grounds in the cup, and like when you finish drinking it, you leave the grounds, you flip it over, it dries and it makes pictures, and then you have somebody intuitive read it, and they tell you things about your past, present, and future. And so my grandmother was apparently legendary. I never got to have a reading because she was in Iran, but my mother also would do it at family parties. And again, I never paid attention to it at all. But my friends loved getting readings. They swore by them. They said that she would see things coming months in advance. And so in graduate school, when I started going home on the weekends to see my parents, I would have coffee with my mom and she would read for me. And I took notes because I was a budding scientist. So I would take notes on everything she said and kind of watch and see what happened. And then I noticed that a lot of what she said would come true. But not only that, she would say about situations that there's no way that she could know, because a lot of the situations would be things I wouldn't even know were coming down the pipeline. So there's no way she could know. And the really creepy thing, which I talk about in the book, was that she would say things that were very small, specific details about situations that were meaningful only to me in regard to the situation. And that's what really like shook me or got my attention, because it was strange. I was like, there's no way that she could know this. And the example I give in the book, which is kind of silly, but I was dating this guy in my like when I was in graduate school, and he had really long eyelashes that I noticed and liked. I thought they were adorable. Like I thought they were my favorite, like part of him. And my mom was reading my coffee, and every time, like while I was dating him, and I never admitted it to her because in our culture too, you don't really tell your parents you're dating until you have someone that you're marrying. So she didn't know I was dating anyone, but she kept saying like, it looks like you have a person in your life, like a guy. And then every time she would just say something about him, she would say, and he has really long eyelashes. And it was so creepy to me because I hadn't told anyone, like I hadn't even told my best friends. It wasn't even something I said out loud. It was just, like a thought internal thing that I had, but like in the coffee cup, if he became represented in this way that was meaningful to me. So that got my attention, but I couldn't explain any of this with my science because there's no model or framework for this in Western mainstream science. So I just kept them separate. I didn't know how it worked. I just knew it did. So I kept it separate. I never thought about it. I really didn't think about the mechanism. But then I had two huge emotional life events that were my mom like saw in the coffee. And one of them was a life or death thing. It was one of my professors was killed. And, she had seen it coming she didn't say exactly. She just said I was going to get really bad news because she didn't want to upset me ahead of time. So she knew it was a death, but she didn't tell me. Anyway, when it happened, it shook me and upset me, obviously, in general, just because it was a terrible thing to happen. But the fact that this was actually about life and death and that it showed up in the coffee made me wonder if, like, how could that information be available? Like, is there such a thing as fate or destiny? How could we know something like that in advance? And then, there was another event, but essentially that's what kind of piqued my interest into, I would say, beyond mainstream science. I kind of started thinking science doesn't explain these experiences that I've had, that I'm like a trained PhD now. Like everyone trusts me to discern, like use probability, use statistics, use my critical thinking skills. I cannot explain these. So, it kind of got curious. And I think it was the life death nature of that reading that really kind of urged me to look into this stuff a little bit more. So after the second event, I kind of had like an existential crisis. It was the first time I felt like depression and despair. And like I'm usually very peppy and optimistic, but it was a dark time. And then it was a relationship that ended, and I was just like felt like, what is the point of all this? Like I felt like life was meaningless. And so I just had a hard time with it, and I didn't know what to even do. So I just continued, living, doing nothing for a few months. But then one of my friends, I was kind of curious about the coffee, and one of my friends was like, oh, do you want to go see the psychic that we use? We're in LA, so there's a lot of psychics here. But I never believed in psychics. And, the readings with my mom are a different dynamic because I'm not paying her. She's not trying to impress me, like it's casual, it's in our home, it's private, it's honest. And so I didn't really know how I felt about that, but my friends took me to some good ones that they knew, and I was blown away. Like just like my mom had said, they knew things that there's no way that they could know. And there would be incidents, and they would have like 7 variables right about it, and they wouldn't be vague variables, like I really scrutinized them. I was like, we would record them and write them down. And my friends and I even swapped readings. So we did this for a while just because we were all kind of curious. Like we never really thought about it, but we're like, are they vague? Like, what if we swapped readings? If they're vague, they should make sense, for all of us. We should be able to swap them, but they weren't. They were very specific to each of us. So that, and then the spiritual part comes in because in the readings, they started talking about, which since I didn't know anything about spirituality, this went over my head, but they would start saying things like, this is a past life thing. You have soul groups. Like, this is one of the lessons you came here to learn. And I was like, what are they talking about? like what lessons? And I was like, okay, I guess they believe in reincarnation, but I don't. So I just ignored a lot of that. But then later, a few months later, I serendipitously heard Chelsea Handler's podcast. I had read her book, Life Will Be the Death of Me, and then she had a podcast on it. And in the book, she's like, I'm a skeptic. She didn't believe anything. And then on the podcast, she had a psychic medium on, Laura Lynn Jackson. And Laura Lynn Jackson starts talking about this stuff that I heard the psychic say, where she's like, oh, we reincarnate, we come here to learn lessons. Earth is like a school, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, this is so weird. I'm like, that's what the psychics said to me. And I was like, do they all go to psychic school or something? Like, where do they even learn? I've never even heard of naive. I'd never heard of any kind of spiritual framework, much less that one. And so that kind of piqued my interest. They mentioned a book on the podcast, Many Lives, Many Masters, and I got it. And then that was really the tipping point. So it's kind of like I got all these nudges. And then that book was written by a psychiatrist who was Columbia and Yale trained. He was an atheist. He wasn't into anything paranormal, but he talks about this patient that he had, and he kind of stumbles into like past life regressions with her. Like she just spontaneously starts doing it in the sessions, but he finds that it cures her of a lot of her anxieties and a lot of the issues that she had, that the normal psychotherapeutic methods he had tried on her for a year and a half, nothing had worked. And suddenly this was working. So anyway, he outlines in the book the spiritual framework. And then I was just curious. Then I got really curious. And I was like, okay, hearing something from psychics is like, or intuitives as I call them now, is one thing. I didn't think you could take them seriously, right? But hearing something from like a well-trained psychiatrist, I was like, okay, I'm interested. So he had like a list of references in the book. So I started reading a lot of the books he mentioned. And then it turns out there's a lot of actual research done by universities like UCLA, Duke, University of Virginia, UC Berkeley. So I started looking up all the scientific studies to see and I was looking at both things, intuitive phenomena and then also the spiritual aspect, because I was so curious. Like I was just like, I would never in a million years have thought you could even have any kind of, this is actually why I wasn't interested in spirituality, is because I didn't think you could prove or disprove it. So I thought, why bother? As a scientist, that's how I thought of it. So when I found out that there were these really interesting studies, I couldn't help but be interested and just start diving into everything. That's how it started.
Now, for the psychics, were some of them out there? Because I've spoke to some people, and they seem like really far out there, and others are more credible with their predictions and so forth. Did you have like a process where you decided which ones were more in it for the money and which ones were more legitimate?
Luckily, my friends had, I usually, people ask me this a lot now, and I say that you should always go to somebody that someone recommended to you. Like if someone had a good experience with them, usually that's the best way, because you can't really go on Yelp, like it's kind of hard to find one. Although there are two websites. I'm going to try to remember right now. Hold on, what they are. One of them actually tests them, makes them pass like a certification. And then another one is, it's like Bob Olson something. He used to be a PI and he wanted to disprove psychic phenomena. And so he went on, similar to me, I guess, kind of went on this like investigation to interview them and disprove it. But then he found out by doing that it was real. And so then he made this website to list the ones that he, had gotten to and thought were legitimate. So there are those websites that you can go, and there are a few certifications that they can get. There's also the Winbridge Research Center, which is one of the places I looked up that did real scientific studies that were peer reviewed and published in scientific journals. They have a list too. So there are places like that you can find, but I usually just tell people to ask someone they know who's had a good reading, because it's kind of hard to. And the other thing is, it really matters how open you are when you go. The more skeptical you are, the worse the reading is going to be for you. I don't know exactly the science. I just know that that's true. Like that's what everyone says, and it's true. And my friends and I found that, like the ones in our group, there were about 4 or 5 of us who did this together, and the one who was extremely skeptical would get the least amount of like specific information in her readings. So it's, you have to be open. And I do also, I believe that there is just like when you go to therapy, right? It takes, or a physician, like sometimes you just don't like people, right? Like you'll go in, you'll be like, I just don't like this doctor, or like this therapist just doesn't resonate, for me. I think it's the same thing with psychic. I mean, I just think that's just a thing with between humans, right? So some people are just not, for whatever reason, like compatible with you. So even if someone recommends someone to you, I mean, hopefully it'll work for you, but if it doesn't, just know that can happen.
So your goal is to understand how the universe works. Like a lot of us are trying to always find out. What have you comprehended so far about how everything works as far as your research?
Everything works well. I would say, I try not to, the way I'm so sorry. I have allergies.
Well,
One
why
sec.
we're here, sorry. That's kind of what I mean, like why we're here.
Yeah. Sorry, I have allergies and I'm house sitting and there's a dog and I'm allergic. Okay.
Or there's a ghost in the house that doesn't want to hear you tell all
I
this nonsense.
know. Okay, so I mean, I try not to believe anything anymore, because that I see it now that because I work with data. I think of it like I used to have an Excel sheet with like data of my worldview, and I locked in. I was like, no updates. The scientific worldview is my worldview. And then I found that I didn't have all the data, right? I hadn't read all these other studies, and I didn't know about all these different spiritual frameworks. And so now I try to stay open and curious and just keep learning, because there's so much out there. And so I feel like my concept of the universe changes every day. But I will say this, I do think that there is meaning. I think the universe is filled with meaning. And I think that when you get things like intuitive readings, or um, messages and dreams or whatever, they're very symbolic. And they don't make sense to us anymore, because we're in such a reductionist, right? That's what our science is based on, is reductionism, breaking things down into particles and atoms. So symbols don't make sense. But I think that, if you look at philosophy, like Plato believed in forms, I think you find a heritage in philosophy, a lot of different philosophies, that there is some sort of deeper qualitative aspect to the universe, right? Like that it's a certain quality, it's like archetypal. There's like ideas and forms and symbols, and it has meaning. So, I mean, I do lean into that. I believe that. I will say I believe that, even though I try not to believe anything anymore. I do think that's where I am. And I also think, and this is based not just on spiritual stuff. This is based on cosmology and physics. And, I read a lot of modern things. Like every day they're coming up with new philosophies of what the universe. But one that is becoming popular is the idea of a participatory universe, in that it does participate with us in some way, so that it's not just like it's a dead, meaningless, random place where we are living in it. It's like there's some sort of interaction, which, if you study any kind of biology or systems, makes complete sense, because everything is interconnected. Everything are networks and systems. Nothing is isolated. So it's really interesting that, our scientific worldview likes to reduce and separate and make things objective. But in actuality, in nature and in the universe, things are not that way. Everything's interconnected. So, so I do think there is some sort of, participation or interconnectedness.
Are you still working as a neuroscientist actively, or are you just a researcher now?
I'm not doing brain research anymore, but I do have a consulting company. So I do work with other companies to create models and do literature reviews and around neuroscience topics. Yeah, I still work in neuroscience.
So do you think as time goes on, more scientists are going to accept that there is kind of a more spiritual side to the universe?
Yeah. So, I will also say this. It actually goes back to your first question. One of my tipping points. Well, I mean, I feel like I already had a lot of, evidence, a lot of empirical evidence I had read and new philosophies. But I did find, in my own project, I interviewed my scientist colleagues because I was curious to know, have you ever experienced anything weird, like an intuitive reading that comes true? What do you think of things like that? Do you think we can discover and know everything with science? And are you spiritual or are you religious? We had never talked about those things. So I interviewed them and I found that most of them, all of them actually, had a story. Everyone had a story about something weird that they couldn't explain. All of them were very open. And we all agreed that science has its limits and there's a lot that we don't know. So that was already encouraging. But then after I published the book, actually, I found a few groups of scientists, engineers, and physicians that have come together because of this, because they believe there is a spiritual aspect to the universe, as well as just, you know, unconventional physical aspects. Like the intuitive readings don't have to be spiritual, actually. They don't have to be. There could be, a normal physical explanation for it, like some sort of signal that we just can't measure yet. So that's possible. So I know there's a lot of different, theories, and people take different sides, but there are different groups of scientists that I've found and joined who think that we're missing a lot, a lot in conventional, all types of science, just because we are committed to this. It's called scientific materialism, this materialist, physicalist, reductionist view of the universe. And if we stick to that, then we're going to miss things. We're going to miss other things, including a spiritual nature. So yeah, so there's a whole community of us, and I think because of the psychedelic renaissance, people are hopeful because we see these new research centers opening up for psychedelics and consciousness. UCSF, Columbia, NYU, I mean, all over. It's crazy how many centers are being opened. And I think psychedelics are interesting because so a lot of this like receptivity to, let's say, the symbolic nature of the universe really comes through what we call altered states of consciousness, such as being on a psychedelic or being in a dream state, or in that state between sleep and wake, that moment but when you're about to fall asleep but you're not fully asleep and you're not fully awake. All of those states there's like a range of consciousness, and it's believed that when you move into the more liminal states, these between and betwixt states, that you have access to more information, other kinds of information. So the fact that, and a lot of weird things happen on psychedelics, a lot of these, intuitive visions, people feel like they can hear other people's thoughts and emotions. They'll see spirits. They'll claim, and a lot of people come out of psychedelic trips not believing in materialism anymore. They come out saying plants have consciousness, the universe is conscious, there are spirits, consciousness survives death. And interestingly enough, that's a lot of the things that you hear in spiritual traditions and a lot of indigenous cultures. So there's a lot of commonality that you hear from people when they come out of these states. And so because of the psychedelic renaissance, I am more hopeful that people are opening their minds, because they can't ignore, as we move into this venture capital backed, FDA approved, psychedelics for mental health space. You're going to have a bunch of people coming out of these states flipped. They're going to flip their worldview and come out, and we can't just ignore them. We can't ignore that, because that's not going to help them integrate back what they've learned, right? Integrate everything into a sense of wholeness, or even integrate back into society. Like we can't just leave them. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I understand that mushrooms are being experimented with by researchers now, as far as people getting off cocaine. They're doing mushrooms, and they're, for instance, more likely to stay off of it, and businessmen and so forth go on a trip on them and totally change their perspectives after. I've never tried them, but what's the theory behind that? Just as what you were saying, it opens your mind to a different side of reality, or
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different theories. If you want this, yeah, I mean, the spiritual, indigenous, I would say, side is yes, these states give you access to a different level of information. If you want the neuroscience explanation, it's that these, which it's probably not either or, right? It's probably both, but a neuroscience psychology explanation of what happens on these substances is that they essentially, your brain has these networks that it's very used to using, right? Your brain gets used to processing and thinking in a very specific way. And because to save energy, your brain never changes that. So that's why we get stuck in these behavioral patterns, stuck in these thought patterns. So when you take a psychedelic, though, what it does is it breaks open those connections and it allows the other parts of the brain to connect. So parts that usually don't talk to each other talk to each other. And then the parts that usually do talk to each other separate. And so that's why when you take a psychedelic, sometimes it's like I can taste a sound, or I can or taste a color or something, because all of your brain is kind of rewiring. And that gives you new psychological perspectives. It gives you new views on experience. The whole world changes for you. And so when you come back, you bring those insights back with you. A lot of times, the reason they're healing too is because they allow access to things that you usually suppress. Like if you have a severe trauma that your ego and your conscious mind doesn't want to deal with on a regular basis, and you never think about it, right? So your behavioral thought pattern is, no, we're not going to touch that because it's too painful. But when you go on a psychedelic, you're in a different state and you are allowed access to that. So you can bring up this trauma and work through it if you're in a safe setting with a therapist or someone who's trained to guide you through it. You can work through it and you kind of release that weight, like that burden that's been on you. You release the energy, you release the neural connection. And that's how it helps people heal. It can bring like a new way of thinking about it. Like, oh, that was something bad that happened to me, but it's over now and I processed it. And then you just move on. So that's the neuroscience psychology explanation for it. Yeah, that's a few different ways to look at it.
And you were talking about paradigms earlier. For people that don't know what those are, could you explain it? And how has yours changed? Because these are kind of the way people are programmed, and some people just never get out of the program. Have you broken out of yours? It sounds like it. And
Yeah,
could you just
definitely.
explain it to people? Sorry.
Yeah, another word for that I like to think of is like a box. Like we have these boxes that we put ourselves in, which are really the way we look at the world or what we believe about the world, right? Like I believe, I don't know, just for what I used to believe. I believe that the universe is meaningless, it's random, and that it doesn't care about me, and that there's no reason for my life or for any of the events in my life, right? And that's like a box that you have around that, or a filter, even a filter that you see everything through, everything that happens to you. And that's I mentioned materialism. Let's say that's one of those filters. And I think that these boxes can really hold us back, right? And it's just like with psychedelics. That's what the psychedelics do, is they let you break out of the box that you've put yourself in, so you can see the world in a new way. But they're not the only thing that can do that. There's a lot of other like breath work and other things you can do. I don't want to suggest that that people should do psychedelics, but I'm just giving an example. That's how it is, breaking out of the paradigm. And it was the same for me. Like I had this, very strict worldview, this very strict box of like the universe is random, it's dead, it's meaningless, life has no meaning, life's events have no meaning, to suddenly this, and everything is material and physical and reductionist. And that was blown open for me because I found that actually most cultures for the history of humanity and across the world, except for Western culture, live by these principles, and it guides their very meaningful lives. And I found that not only for myself, I found spirituality to be surprisingly valuable. It improved my overall well-being and mental health. But that the statistics also show that in the literature, and they show that for chronic illness, like for health outcomes, it improves people's health. So I think that, so I think breaking out of the box that you're in is basically like a paradigm shift. And when I talk about psychedelics too, and I like being hopeful about the psychedelic renaissance, and you might hear people saying this because they say like hopefully it'll be a paradigm shift. That's what they mean, that that we break out of this one way of viewing the world that really has only dominated Western culture for the last couple hundred years, whereas the rest of the time humanity's been on Earth, it's been driven by many other worldviews. So that's what I mean. I hope that makes sense.
And I notice more people are open to the idea of consciousness now, that like when you pass away, it's just the body dying. Something else happens with your consciousness. What's your theory on that from the research you've done so far?
Yeah, I've read so many. So, okay, as a neuroscientist, when I came across theories like that, when I was on this journey, I like would retreat back into my box, and I was like, no, consciousness comes from the brain. That's what I learned in my PhD. Like that's the truth. And then I was closed off to those theories. But after doing again so much reading, reading so much evidence about like near death experiences, and again all these visions of people seeing loved ones who have passed away, who then give them like meaningful and useful and true information that's relevant to their lives in the moment, you start to like wonder. And so, and then when I went to look into the, again, scientific journals, I found that in the last few years, there's been quite, maybe a handful, maybe I wouldn't say quite a few, but there's been a handful of actual scientific models being proposed of like, maybe consciousness is an energy that runs through everything. And when it interacts with our physical brains, our subjective experience, our awareness, our personalities come to life. There's there's a few different theories like that I started to wonder. I was like, oh, okay. I mean, we're making headway in scientific journals. I mean, maybe it's possible that, yeah, consciousness is something. And, a lot of William James we call him the father of psychology. He was a brilliant psychologist from the, American. He was at Harvard in the early 1900s. And he had, looked at all these different kinds of altered states. And he talked about like maybe the brain is a filter. A brain is a filter for consciousness. Aldous Huxley talks about it. I mean, there's been a lot of people who've put that theory forward before because they looked at these different kinds of evidence, and they're like, there's so much, there's so many stories that people have information from that they shouldn't have, right? From another space, another location, another time point. And they do. And I know I'm being really vague, but there's, a lot of, the US government even funded a whole research program on this for 25 years, and they used it operationally in the military. It was that reliable for someone to like close their eyes, remote view some location on the other side of Earth and get useful information for the military. It's that useful. So when you start looking at those kinds of things, you're like, I mean, the evidence doesn't add up. Like our model of neuroscience is not enough. Like it explains certain things, but it's like you have evidence in a box and you're like, we can explain what's in this box, but then there's like 50 other boxes and you can't explain any of those. Then your model's not very good. So I'm definitely more open to, yeah, models. I mean, it's possible. it's definitely possible, the consciousness. I don't know. I kind of like the filter theory, but I don't, we have a lot of work to do.
So you mentioned earlier some of the psychic experiences you've had. Could you share any of your past life regressions or psychic experiences that you may have learned something about yourself from, or perhaps you don't take it 100% and you just add it to the research, but you found it interesting?
Yeah. Let's see. I did a few past life regressions because they sounded so healing. Um, and I don't know, I was just curious, honestly. So I did, I think, two or three of them. And I mean, the stories were very boring. Like, I had nothing exciting. One was like an Irish farm life, one was like ancient Rome or something, but it was not, I wasn't like a senator or anything. It was just a normal life. Um, but what I found interesting about them was that was how it worked. My therapist, she was like, "Close your eyes, like whatever." And it's basically you just get into a really relaxed meditative state. You're conscious and aware the whole time. You're just very, very relaxed. And she kind of just says, like, "What do you see now?" And I just started telling her what I was seeing in my mind. And I've been meditating for years, and I have really vivid dreams, so I am a very good visualizer. So I don't know if that matters, but I was, whatever I saw pop into my head, I would just tell her, and it was crazy. Like, it just turned into this whole story. And by the end, she was like, you're probably going to feel like you made it up, but don't worry, just go with it." And so we went with it. And then, I died in that life. I was telling her, I'm like, "Oh, I just died and I'm floating above my body." And she's like, "Okay, are you going?" I don't remember the details, but it's something like I went into this space between lives, and I met with each of the people in my life in that life. So like my husband, my kids, or whatever. So one by one. And then she would ask, "What are you saying to them and what are they saying to you?" And I remember at that point, I remember thinking like, "Oh shit, like I made all this up. It's not going to work." But then I started answering her, like I started telling her, I was like, "I'm telling him this." And then I started like weeping, like not crying, like weeping. Like I didn't even have time to process. I didn't have a thought that made me sad, that made me cry. Like it was emotion from my like stomach, which I've only had that reaction when I've gotten really, really bad news, like in real life, a few times in my life. It was just pouring out of me. I couldn't stop crying. And I didn't even know why I was crying. I was just like weeping. And I couldn't believe it. Like, um, I met with the soul after soul after soul, and I just was releasing so much emotion. I just couldn't believe it. And so at the end, I was staring, at my therapist. I was like, "What the hell was that?" And she's like, "Yeah. So that's past life regression." And she's like, and she said, "The way you know it's real is the emotion." She's like, "Because I could have you tell a story right now and you wouldn't." She's like, "At least the research shows like you wouldn't, evoke that kind of emotion like if you're just creating a fictional story." So to actually engage that emotion and release such a deep, it's a cathartic emotional release. She said that that's how you know it's real. I I did have some really I'm trying to remember. Oh, I mean, this was one weird thing. Like one of my it was something like one of my people in my life. Oh, and she doesn't ask you until the very, very, very end. Like bring up your husband, let's say, in that life. Is it someone you know in this life? So they'll ask you that because oftentimes the theory is that you reincarnate with certain people over and over again because you like them, or I don't know, you have karma to work out with them. So at the end, and so I remember she had asked that, and I remember in the story part, I had kept talking about like gladiolas, which I don't know any kind of I don't know many kinds of flowers, but for some reason I was like, they're gladiolas. I know, and they were purple, and I knew what they look like. And then at the very end, one of the people in my life, she asked like, "Who is it?" And I was like, "It's my aunt." And then my aunt in this life. And then like 2 days later, my aunt texted me. But she's a florist, and she texted me a picture of gladiolas, purple ones. And so I was floored, and I thought that's just a weird coincidence. I mean, that was strange. So there were little things like that. The intuitives, I think there's I never say what it is, but one of them this is one that I found on my own who's very, very good. She it still gives me goosebumps because it was so weird. She was telling me something, she was whatever doing a reading for me, and she said, she was saying my name over and over again. She's like, Mona, your name's Mona, right? And I was like, yes, my name is Mona. And I was taking notes, so I wasn't really paying attention to her. And then she suddenly said, like, I'm hearing another name for you. And I was like, nope, that's my name. And she kept saying it though. She wouldn't let it go. She's like, no. Like, they're not letting it go. Like, they want me to, she's like, they want me to, like, you have another name. And then she said the name, and I like dropped my pen because there is another name that only my, parents and my brother call me, but nobody knows that. And I didn't even think of it, because it's not something people call me except my family. So when she said it, and it was a Persian word, she's not Persian. The woman was in I dropped my pen. I was like, what? Like, how could you know that? It was it was a very creepy moment, actually, because it was just one of those, like, again, very deep, dark, meaningful thing to you that nobody or very few people know. And she knew it. And I was like, okay, this is like too creepy. No, I'm just kidding. She was great. I still go to her.
That's very interesting. And I guess you can write off all of these therapy sessions as part of your research since you do
Right?
books.
Yeah, it is research.
That's great. Somebody's wondering if you work with crystals at all, or what are your thoughts on crystals?
I don't work with crystals. I mean, I buy them because they're pretty. I will say that I read one. So there's this scientist who was a materials scientist from Stanford. His name is Dr. William Tiller. He did some of the best experiments on, frankly, like intention and karma, and how like your consciousness can direct physical matter. And in one of those experiments, he used crystals. And you'll have to forgive me because I'm not a material scientist or a physicist, so I don't remember the exact details, but I remember that there was something about the crystals changing the energy in the room, and it like affected the intention. You can look it up online on his website. It's William Tiller. So that's the only study I can think of off the top of my head where I've read about crystals. I don't know, but I do know that intuitives and a lot of cultures, actually, a lot of indigenous cultures, a lot of other cultures use them and believe in them. And I mean, they do, everything actually does have frequency, even though people like to roll their eyes because it's new agey or whatever. But in science, like, everything does have a frequency. Your cells have frequencies. Everything is frequency.
I actually had someone once, an Indian woman, pray on a crystal, and I had back pain. And I was just doing this to play along. And then she put the crystal on my back, and it turned black, and my pain was gone from my back.
God, that's cool.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
real eye-opening that way.
That's what a lot of the research if you go to the Institute for Noetic Sciences, they have a great website. They're doing great research. William Tiller. There's a lot of places doing research like that look at like that. Like, if you go into a deep meditative state and you can infuse objects with your intention, intention for healing or abundance or whatever it is. Early research. There's not enough funding for it. So if anyone's watching who's rich, you should donate to IONS because they could do a lot more research.
And as far as manifestation, that's a big thing nowadays, that we can manifest our own lives and our own healing. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah. As I mentioned, I think the universe is participatory, and I do think we co-create with it. And I think a lot of the intuitives say that, but a lot of the research shows that, like I said, that your intention, your consciousness can affect and change physical matter. I mean, how much and how exactly, I don't, no, nobody knows, but I do think that it's now, I believe right now, I think it's so important to move through life consciously, with good intentions, because I do think it affects everything around you. So, and I do think you can, personally, I do think we, whether it's neuroscience or psychology or spiritual, I totally believe in like doing manifestation things. I love, lists and journals and envisioning what the future is going to look like. All those things really, really help and really work, work for you, no matter how you think it is. If it's metaphysical or just neuroscience, it doesn't really matter. I think they're great.
Now, I'm not sure if you can answer this or not, but you did talk about psychedelics. Do you recommend people go? I know here, even though mushrooms are illegal, there's mushroom shops. Weed
Yeah.
is legal in Canada. Like, how would you recommend someone go about it if they wanted to experiment with that? Which I
Yeah.
don't know if you could even answer or not, but
I definitely do not recommend that you just do them. I think, as I mentioned, sometimes when you take a psychedelic, it can release something you've been suppressing, and sometimes that's a trauma. And it's not always helpful if a trauma just comes up if you don't have the support to process it. So I do always recommend, and plus, honestly, you never know if you're going to get a good or a bad trip. So it's always good to like have a good guide or a therapist with you who's experienced, who can, walk you through it, guide you through the experience, and can help you process whatever happens. Sometimes you see things and experience things that you can't make sense of, and it's so helpful to have somebody, especially someone who's super trained to guide you through it. And I think that, it's legal in Oregon. It's becoming legal in Colorado. It's becoming legal. So I think in the future, I mean, I think it'll be easier to like travel to places where it's legal and get the kind of support that you need. Hopefully, I don't think that's very far off.
as far as what you'd like to accomplish with your book, what is your goals as far as the scientific community and regular people like me?
Yeah, I think for the scientists, I really wanted to. I, Honestly, with the scientists, when I was talking to, like I said, my colleagues in private, they would admit these things to me in private, but a lot of us don't talk about it in public. But it became so ridiculous to me. I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, this is so stupid that we are admitting and having these great conversations behind closed doors. But then when we go, go to the lab, like, oh, no, you act all tough, like, oh, I don't believe in that, or that's stupid. That is disingenuous. It's inauthentic, and we're never going to figure out science and and reality of our universe. And especially for neuroscience, if we ignore all of these classes of evidence, we're never going to know how the brain and the mind work, or consciousness, or any of it. And so then, what are we doing? Wasting our time? Like, what are we even doing? So that was my message for scientists, and then for the general public. I think I just wrote the book for it was really hard for me. The whole journey was very hard. It kind of sounded, I don't know, I made it sound easy, but it wasn't. When I started reading this material and found myself starting to be open to it, I started to have an identity crisis, because I was like, no, I'm a smart scientist. I worked hard for this reputation and this respect, and I'm not going to throw it away, on all of this. And it was like torture in my mind for a very long time, just like really difficult to come to terms with it. But I had also never been happier ever. So I found that spirituality was valuable, as I mentioned, and helpful. And I found, even in the simple idea that the universe is meaningful and that your life is meaningful and that there are signs and symbols all around you for you, was such a game-changing idea. It helped me in my day-to-day. And also the idea of like, maybe I did choose these challenges for my life. If I did, what am I supposed to be learning right now? Instead of like, oh, this sucks, and then being sad about something, flipping it to be like, what am I supposed to be learning? What is this message for me? So really it's to help, like, it's the book I wish I had because I had a hard time with it. So it's kind of being like, hey, a lot of people believe this stuff. A lot of scientists believe it. There's a lot of science behind it. It's not as clearly wrong as mainstream everything would like you to believe. So it's okay. And also, even if there was no evidence, but there is, but even if there wasn't, it's okay. You can believe whatever you want. Like, if it helps you and it makes you happier, which it does, spirituality, as I said, increases well-being, increases mental health, then it's great.
Have you done much research into Bruce Lipton's theories on things?
A little bit. I know that I
He
think
talks
he's
about
one of those
epigenetics a lot.
co-creators, right? Like, we
Yeah.
manifest our reality.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not super familiar, but yes, peripherally. I think he also did epigenetics, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
he did He was supposedly a cell biologist, and he does epigenetics now. That's just why I was curious because you mentioned epigenetics earlier.
Yeah, I'm not super, super familiar. I should be more. I will look into his stuff. But yeah, I know generally, vaguely, he falls into that camp, but I can't say I've dug into his ideas.
And for people that want to pick up the book, where can they get a hard copy, and is it available on audiobook yet?
Yeah, it is on audiobook. I read it. I actually did. I voiced it, and the book is sold wherever books are sold. But it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can find links to it on my website, which is monasobhaniphd.com. And yeah, I think you can find everything there.
And I'll put a link to it in the description of this video once we're done this, for people that watch this video after it airs. And the last thing I want to ask you, you mentioned your Iranian background. How did your family accept your research? Are they very open to it, or do they still have kind of walls up related to their religious beliefs?
Um, my family's pretty open. I mean, I think most people have a little resistance. Like I said, everyone is in their boxes. And I find very few people who have no box and who are just open to anything, because that's just how humans are. So, yeah, I mean, I think my family is very excited that I found something I'm this passionate about. And I think they see a difference in me and in my happiness level. My mom was always a little bit spiritual. So I think she's happy. Like, we can talk about those things. But yeah, like, I don't know if she believes in reincarnation. I don't know if she does or doesn't. But you can't expect everybody to be on board with every idea. And the truth is, we don't know the final answer to everything. So that's why I try to stay open.
And what would you like people to take away from this interview as well as your book? Like, what's the one thing, if they've been listening to you today, that you'd like them to walk away with knowing?
Just that we should constantly stay radically curious and try to keep breaking out of our boxes. Because even though it's uncomfortable, I think it benefits us. It always ends up benefiting us because having other perspectives helps us understand other people. And I really think we need a lot more of that in our world.
As far as social media, I don't know how private you are, but do you have any social media where people can look you up? I put your website on the screen for people.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I don't use it that much, but there's a page. I think, oh my gosh, can I remember? Maybe I'll send you the links. I don't want to say the wrong one.
Yeah, you send me what you wanted, the description, and I'll put it in there after. But thank you. It's always nice to speak with someone with the intelligence level of a PhD and a neuroscientist. It's so
Thank you so
nice.
much for having me. It was really nice chatting with you.
Oh, well, that's great. I really appreciate it. I wish you a good weekend, and I'll let you close this off with whatever you want to say to the fans.
Yeah, I think just stay radically curious, and I don't know. I think I would also like to say, um, just to have hope. I think that the universe really does have our back, which it kills me to say that because I never believed it, but I really think it's true.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and click the subscribe button to not miss